Welcome back, my friends, to the Real News Network podcast. I am your host, Mel Buer. I wanted to take a moment once again to thank you, our listeners, for joining us week after week. Without you, none of this would be possible. Whether you've got our shows on while you're making coffee in the morning, put our podcasts on during your commute to and from work, or give us a listen throughout the workday, the Real News Network is committed to bringing you ad-free, independent journalism that you can count on. We care a lot about what we do, and it's through donations from dedicated listeners like you that we can keep on doing it. Please consider becoming a monthly sustainer of the Real News Network by heading over to therealnews.com/donate. And if you want to stay in touch and get updates about our work, then sign up for our free newsletter at therealnews.com/sign-up. As always, we appreciate your support in whatever form it takes. Housing in this country is a nightmare, to put it bluntly. Over 1/3, that's 34% of available housing in this country, is occupied by renters. In California alone, over 5 million people rent their homes and apartments. That's 13.6% of the available 44 million homes in this country. That's no small number. The vast majority of renters in the United States are between the ages of 29 and 44, and many of them rent an apartment with one or more roommates. Over 40% of tenants are paying more than 35% of their income toward monthly rent. With wages remaining stagnant and federal minimum wage still at a paltry $7.25 an hour, it doesn't take long to see how skyrocketing rents create a serious problem for this nation's working class. In the past decade, tenants unions, activists, organizers, nonprofits, and legislative bodies across the country have made some strides in restricting the monumental control that landlords have over the market and closing long-exploited loopholes that leave tenants with little to no housing options, or even homeless. But the struggle is still ongoing, and there is much work still to be done. With me today to discuss this is Esteban Girón, organizer and 10-year member of the Crown Heights Tenants Union in New York City. We are discussing the dire nature of the housing crisis in this country and what we as workers and tenants can do about it. Welcome to the show, Esteban. Thank you so much for taking some time this morning to talk to me about a very important piece of living in the United States, which is our current housing crisis and what individual renters can do to try and alleviate some of the worst landlord practices in this country. So thanks for coming on.
Pleasure to be here.
To start off this conversation, I wanted to take a moment to give our listeners a sense of really how dire the housing crisis is in this country. From your perspective, organizing in New York City, what sort of conditions are you seeing amongst renters?
Well, there's been, I'd say in the last decade, there's been this slow but steady degradation of the living conditions that we all happen to live in particular rent stabilized tenants. Just, basic things are not getting done. Buildings are falling apart. And at the same time, neighborhoods are gentrifying. And so there's buildings are getting overvalued 4 or 5 times over, and they continue gaining in value even as they start deteriorating. So that's and that's for the people that are housed. Like, we have a tremendous number of homeless individuals now that are a direct product of landlord greed, as far as I'm concerned. And so like the crisis is widespread, and it was before COVID even. So you can imagine, like, as with everything else, it's exacerbated that. So it's tricky. It's hard to organize. It's hard to organize around it.
Yeah, I know from where I'm sitting in Los Angeles, our homeless population is something like 62,000 individuals in the Los Angeles area are currently unhoused. I think a lot of folks are, especially in larger urban areas, feeling the squeeze from continuing to see higher rents. The market value apartments are skyrocketing, and the number of rent stabilized units are dwindling,
Yep.
really. And I'm curious, in your organizing it to this sort of wider vein, what are some of the unique challenges that renters in rent-controlled, rent-stabilized apartments are experiencing when it comes to not just like deteriorating conditions, but how landlords treat them and what that relationship looks like?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think I tend to look at this through the lens of tenant power, and that's sort of like the baseline thing that I sort of guide, at least the work that I do. And we made a big dent in that and a big shift in that interaction in 2019 with rent laws that were transformative and once in a generation. Took a lot of effort, had to do a lot of electoral work in addition to the regular organizing work. But we basically closed all but like a couple of loopholes that were decimating our rent stabilized stock, basically. We'd lost like something like 300,000 apartments or something, like just insane. I think there's like roughly over a million, a little bit over a million rent stabilized units right now. And so, like, we were losing everywhere. We were losing in housing court. We were losing because the laws were just not conducive to tenants having any sort of power in a relationship. So what we started doing in the Crown Heights Tenant Union, and this was a decade ago, we started finding other ways to get what we wanted. So whether it meant shaming a landlord in the press or going out and talking to their neighbors and passing out flyers in their neighborhood or any sort of like direct action stuff that was not, we weren't doing anything illegal, but we weren't really operating as like we're going to win something in housing court or even in the legislature. And I think that's always going to be true. I think that's rent stabilization itself was won after much after a lot of actually initially it was like price control set for the war, but New York City's had some version of that because of like every generation there seems to be a tenant movement that sort of realizes this is the way and then moves forward from that. So yeah, and that was 4 years ago. The change has been, like I said, transformative. The fact that we're not really losing units anymore in the way that we were before. And you can imagine, like, when you have the ability to take a rent stabilized unit to market rate, sometimes doubling the rent, everything that a landlord does is going to be like a tenant has a target on their back because they just want them out of there. So a lot of stuff you can't even really quantify with data, because it's like, how do you quantify how many people just get annoyed with their landlord or get harassed out of their apartment? A lot of self eviction and this sort of thing. So it was a really dire situation, and it's been really hard to defend too. Like, landlords are there right now in front of the Supreme Court trying to get the 2019 rent laws reversed, and they're still trying to push the legislature, and they're still trying to build a narrative that makes it out to be landlords are suffering, and we know that's not true. So
Right. I mean, renters are suffering.
renters are always suffering.
You hear some pretty wild stories about the lengths that landlords will go to get individuals to vacate their rent controlled apartments in Los Angeles, which is kind of, the thing that I've been paying attention to a lot. You hear a lot of stories from the LA Tenants Union about individuals who have, scary mob looking men knocking on their door every day, trying to intimidate them to leave, offering absurd sums of money to get them out of the apartments, right? Sometimes as much as $100,000, which is wild.
We've seen like $250,000 for buyouts before. Yeah.
Right. And, there's no guarantee you'll see that money once you leave,
Right.
And it's, it's the principle of the matter, right? This rent stabilization is meant to ensure that folks stay housed, right? And landlords are doing everything they can to circumvent those laws, and to seeing that. I think it's really important to note that the tenants unions and the legislative efforts that have been happening in New York are an important blueprint for how to work on a wide variety of fronts to protect tenants from these aggressive, manipulative, exploitative landlords, right? And it's something that can be replicated.
The thing about it that I think is makes it interesting is that we realize the value and the need for not just like at the building level having some sort of organization, but then being able to translate that into like a statewide or even national sort of focus. And that's you do the incremental changes within the the context of the law, and they're absolutely necessary. But in no way does it trump the value of just knowing my neighbors and knowing my neighborhood. Both things have to be there, and I think that's the thing that tenant unions are doing now. Like, I think that's the thing that we're doing well, is figuring out how to do all those together. And sometimes we mess up, and sometimes we don't give enough focus to certain things. But overall, I'd say over the last 10 years, it's really been, just in retrospect, it's actually been pretty successful, I think.
Yeah. Um, to that point, I mean, in Teddy Ostro's most recent article for the Real News, New York's tenant unions are playing the long game.
Mhm.
You spoke on the importance of building community-wide tenants unions to help combat this rising tide of sort of pro-landlord, anti-renter policies. You said, and I quote, because I think this is a really important quote for our listeners, I think the goal of any tenant unionist is ultimately a citywide, neighborhood-wide, statewide tenant union that has sufficient power to be able to force a lot of landlords to do what we want them to do. Can you kind of let's kind of unpack this just a little bit for our listeners, because I think it's a really important piece of this, right? We have really a diversity of tactics in trying to combat these anti-renter policies in order to really stabilize or um, improve the material conditions of working class renters, which is the vast majority of individuals.
Yeah.
The housing crisis is for us and our, millennial generation, for
Oh
individuals
yeah,
who are
we
younger, you know,
we came into
we
this
the
this
hope
whole thing. Yeah.
yeah, the hope that we have is, being able to pay our rent.
Yeah.
The idea of buying a house is a pipe dream.
Yeah.
So what does that mean for us? And, why is it so important for renters to organize these tenant unions? What does this do for the strength of a community, for example, or the ability to sort of push back against this exploitation?
So I think, one thing to sort of just put out there as a baseline is that I sort of found my way to socialism as a concept exclusively through the work that I was doing as a tenant organizer, and it happened fairly quickly, and it, like, nothing else made sense in that context anymore. I hadn't read any theory, I didn't know, like, any, but I could tell that there was that, like, yeah, this is capitalism gone really bad, and it was put, so plain, because the way that landlords operate is just like the absolute worst of the worst, capitalist. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, we have organized in a way that, yes, build community. I remember feeling like this was the first time that I had ever lived in a neighborhood anywhere in my life that I knew so many people when I left the building, and that I had, like, a real sense of, like, grounding that I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. And I couldn't imagine even moving out of my apartment, like, because of course, once you have a rent stabilized apartment, like, that's the lowest price that you're ever going to pay for an apartment. And, like, one of the things that we try to get people to do is to just, like, put down roots, and just, because what happens in gentrification here in New York and LA and other places is that landlords are able to continue increasing rents by renting to sort of transient, younger folks. And so if you can get some of those folks to put down roots, then you're already combating the problem. If you can get folks to not take a $250,000, a buyout, that completely shuts down a landlord's business model. And that's what we've been trying to disrupt, because the systems right now are so heavily favored to landlords. It's the way that property works in really everywhere in the world. Like, there's really no borders for this anymore. You've got, like, Blackstone and Acalius and huge corporations that are doing the same thing to us that they're doing in Spain, and they're doing in Australia. Like, it's become such a universal problem, and it's not even just, like, apartment buildings. These are, like, single family homes are dealing with the same thing. So, um, I think the idea of a tenant union, at least for us, and we started in 2000, the Crown Heights Tenant Union started in 2013. I joined maybe 2 months later, as part of that. And what we what we thought would be, and I still believe this is kind of the way, is if we can get like a strong local organization and we can get this replicated in different neighborhoods in New York, then we can put together something citywide. And then at that point, try to replicate it in other cities and then bring it statewide. I don't know that, the Autonomous Tenant Union Network is all of North America. So there's some sense of that. But one of the nonprofits, the way that nonprofits do this work, probably worked well at some point in the last 50 years, but it really stopped working. I think after the financial crisis, like it's not the same. And the way, the nonprofit sort of model is obviously severely lacking as far as we're concerned. And we constantly fight against it. Like, we're not a nonprofit. We're not even incorporated. Like, we value our independence from not only politicians, but like we don't take foundation grants, for example, because we don't want to have to do stuff that is not what we actually want to do. We don't want to have to be we don't want to have to answer to anybody in terms of like what tactics we're going to use and all of that. And so that's the value, I think, of autonomous tenant unions, is that the tenants are always guiding. We don't have staff, we don't have and we don't have a hierarchy. So we are very much like anybody can be making the decisions, and we're doing them collectively, and we're doing it together. And so and there's like, if folks are interested in reading about unions like ours, the website is atun, ATUN rsia.org. And that's actually Autonomous Tenant Union Network. And what is the Spanish? The RSIA is the Spanish
Yeah.
part of that. And this is it was started by the LA Tenant Union as well. So and yeah, I mean, what we organized around like some points of unity, saying that we believe that tenants are anybody that's not housed or doesn't have control over their own housing is a tenant. That could include people they have a mortgage. That could include elderly folks living in a nursing home, like just basically anybody that does not have control over their own housing. And then I think a really key thing, which Teddy speaks about in the article, is reorienting around a tenant as opposed to housing. So we don't consider ourselves like a housing organization, because it's not about feeding into this already existing capitalist system of housing. Like, we want to do away with that, and the point is tenant power. Like, it's within us. So that's actually it seems like a small thing, but it's a significant variation from what happens. So yeah, we have these, we have these sort of not rules, but just like things that we agreed to. And I don't remember how many tenant unions now there are, but we're in Wisconsin, we're in Vancouver, we're in Texas, we're obviously in California. We're like the two of the biggest ones are LA Tenant Union, and then Tank, which is Tenant and Neighborhood Council in the Bay Area. I actually went to LA last year, a year and a half ago, maybe, for the first big convention that we did for this, and it was just amazing. Like the fact that I can organize in a building with 50 units in New York City and actually have so much in common with literally a tenant union of 10 people from West Virginia. That to me is the real test of does this work? Is this replicable? Can we do this in a larger scale? And it is it really is. But it's, this is 10 years is not very long in the trajectory of how long landlords have been in charge of all of this, and what kind of power they have. But we're chipping away at it. I think there's no other way right now. I don't think that there's whether it's the nonprofits or political considerations. I don't think that really anybody has a good answer right now for what to do about the crisis, other than organizing from the base up. And I think that's the point. Organizing from the base up. There's been these pushes to have a statewide tenant union. before having the base for it, and that's like the opposite of how it should work, you know. And I know there's a lot of parallels with the labor movement too,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. And Teddy talks about this a lot in his article, where that you can kind of see these democratic reform movements in various business unions, where you are kind of switching the narrative from a top-down sort of organization to one that takes its cues from the bottom up. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. I also think you made a really good distinction about um, the sort of restraints that nonprofit housing initiatives have in building tenant power, and actually challenging some of the sort of landlord status quo.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
it? You know what I mean?
yeah.
So and to kind of speak to that, you're right. I think that there is something. Nonprofits do have to take their cues from what they can and cannot organize for as, ostensibly political organizations. There's a lot of rules for how you get your nonprofit status, and your funding, is paramount. And so you really have to kind of pick your battles. Like, what can that particular tool in the toolbox do? Perhaps homeless individual outreach needs more of a boost from a foundation grant than something else, right? And I think you are correct as well that there is no one size fits all solution to a housing crisis that is centuries in the making in this capitalist country, right? And you also make a good point, and this is an optimistic thing to maybe kind of hang our hat on here, is that every successive generation seems to have a uh, successful, or at least uh, lasting enough sort of legacy of housing movement, right? That responds to the specific conditions of that particular generation. And we are experiencing some of the same. You and I both know that the housing market has not been the same since 2008. That the same sort of opportunities afforded to our parents 40, 50 years ago uh, doesn't exist now. And so, those specific economic conditions are unique to our own shared existence, right? And so the solutions to that are going to look a little bit different. I was fortunate enough to spend time with members of the Autonomous Tenants Union Network. I went to the Socialism conference last year as part of
Oh yeah,
some
I
of
was on
their
a
news
panel for
coverage.
that.
Yeah, I was there for your
Oh,
panel. Yeah.
nice, nice.
Yeah, yeah. And I got a chance to really hang out and see how each tenant union, um, for all of their similarities in terms of what you guys are organizing against or for, everyone's got a little bit of a different sort of take on how that works,
Yeah,
right? And I think of the older elders from Kansas City, right, who are speaking to specific things that are happening in Kansas City, for example,
right.
or what the much younger radical activists are doing in LA with the way that they organize their tenant union. There is space there.
Yeah,
And if you are stuck under the model of, the sort of nonprofit model or the top down model, that type of variety, that type of ability, the space to be able to fill in gaps as needed from the grassroots level can happen,
the flexibility, and
exactly.
what's the word I'm looking for is not even flexibility, but the sort of
Dynamic
yeah, like
nature. Yeah.
the ability to sort of put your feet anywhere that they'll land, and try new things, and like, see that things don't work, or see what does work. And one more thing about the sort of cross section between labor and housing is that you're dealing with essentially the same rank and file. Like, these are like, the workers are the tenants, are the workers are the tenants, and that is also, I think, instructive that we're getting more radicalized folks in the housing movement, because within labor there's this surge of rank and file organizing. There's organizations within the unions that are pushing for change, and then there's, you've got like Amazon and Starbucks, and the sort of newer wave of the really exciting wave of labor, um that I think is turning everything on its head, and we face, even with legal stuff, we face some of the same stuff. Like there's a lot of push, I think, in California and San Francisco, for example, there's a push to legalize, in a way, organizing and sort of define what a unit is, and like basically do what National Labor Relations Board does basically. And we've actually pushed against that because it's like the that takes away the flexibility. That means that we can't, for example, organize two families that are living in a home that's just like that's not a big building. Usually these laws put some sort of like restrictions on the number of units and that sort of thing, and it just tries to box everything up in a way that's tidy and I think that's nimble was the word I was looking for. Like the ability to just LATU is actually a really great example of that, because the variety of types of housing that they organize around is so bad. Like I was there for the weekend and just I saw so many different like situations that you have to approach, in some ways very differently, and in other ways it's the same thing. Like it's still like the root is still talking to your neighbor, because that's who's going to know about what your landlord is doing, and getting together with more neighbors, because our foundational thing is the rent strike. Like that's ultimately what can cause the change. And the rent strike requires that you have some sort of leverage on a landlord, just like any strike does. And that's easier to do in a 50-unit building than it is in a small two-family home. But you get enough two-family homes owned by the same landlord, and you've got a rent strike. Like you can do it. So um, I think yeah, 2008 really changed the like not just all over the country, but like the way development would happen here in New York. And that's another area that we are super involved in. Like there's this push to build more housing. There's a very supply side driven push from the acronym is YIMBY versus NIMBY, which is yes in my backyard. And like people that say that all you have to do is build more market rate housing, more luxury housing, and then the people that are income eligible for that will take that, and then like the poor folks will be able to fill in the housing. And it's like this whole trickle down, like repeat of trickle down economics, and it doesn't work. And it changes, that's the thing that changes the neighborhood. Like that's what brings the gentrification. And so it's amazing to look back and see all these different things that we have to get involved in. Like I couldn't just get involved in my tenant union. I had to start going to community board meetings, and now I sit on the land use committee of my community board. And it's like you don't think about having to do those things, but you really got to keep an eye out, because there's just so many forces working together to shut you down and to work around you. And they're very good at it. They're really very good at it. And I think I think what we're developing now with the Autonomous Tenant Union Network, and we actually have I think on March 3rd, yeah, March 3rd, we have we've been trying to do like an annual conference. And so we're doing a virtual one this year. Anybody can go to the website, sign up, and a couple of days of workshops with different tenant unions. There's like skill sharing, um, I look at that and I think about like the possibilities of uh, thinking of something like national rent control, or homes guarantee, or some sort of model of social housing that would actually be, that would be transformative for the entire population, and that we could do that at a not just a state level, but on a national level. And again, that's that requires in my opinion, that requires the ability to have both nonprofits that have like the institutional support, that have the money, the staff to do a lot of this stuff. Like, like we don't pay for buses to go to Albany. We hop on the bus with the nonprofits that are paying for it. So like there's a symbiotic relationship that happens there. They take us to Albany, and then we can like yell at the politicians in ways that they can't. And we're gonna have to be able to do that, on a national level. And some of that's already started happening. Like when the landlords challenged the 2019 rent laws, in the Supreme Court. There's still one case that's outstanding, and it's actually my landlord is the person, like one of the plaintiffs in that case. Yeah, it's a mess. And the thing about it was that it threatened LA's rent control and the Twin Cities rent control, because it essentially is trying to end rent control as a thing in New York. And if that happens at the Supreme Court, that applies to the entire country. And so we found ourselves in a situation where it was like, all right, now we're all in the same boat. This could affect everybody. And I think, we're close to clearing that. Like we cleared like 2 or 3 cases already that they rejected. And we have one more that we have to, get through. But it's a good indication that that this is, globalized, nationalized. Like we're all dealing with the same landlords, and they're conspiring against us in much the same ways. And so it's it can be overwhelming. Like it can be really overwhelming. Now that you mentioned that, I have this poster. This was made by one of the people that was on that panel, and it says "Hands off, decommodify all housing," and it's just like a cute little, and that's what is now sort of like the next horizon for, it's like for us, like we tend to be a little bit more, we tend towards believing that this can be done at a municipal level, at a level of the state actually running and creating this housing. There's some benefits to things like a co-op or a community land trust that's like jointly owned by the people, but really, like at the scale that we need to be able to do it, we need to be able to do it. The city has to be able to do it, the state, the federal government, and not in the way that they did with public housing, where they starved, that the funding for that, and crippled it. I think there's possibilities to do that, and it's like we're spending the money already. Like we in New York, we were spending billions of dollars in tax breaks to build luxury housing, and when we could have just been building it ourselves. We have the land, we have we could have been doing it with unions. Like it's and so that is sort of like the next, I think, how we get out of this situation that we're in with landlords, because it's never gonna, like, it might seem like a pipe dream, but there's no future where landlords exist and tenants still have power. There's just that's never going to happen. That can't be what we're fighting for. And I think that's the other thing that nonprofits tend to, they tend to focus really specifically on one law or one, housing court or whatever it is. It's like one little piece of the larger system. And I think that it's really important that there be part of the movement that is looking beyond that. It's just like saying, like, when do we win socialism, right? Like you have to have the people that really have in their mind, like, we need to get to that next space. And then you have the other people that are like pragmatists, that are really making sure that as we're getting to that space, we're still protected, that we're still able to live, and
Yeah, I mean, the struggle continues.
yeah, absolutely.
But I think just kind of as a final parting thought before we wrap up, I think what you and your fellow tenant organizers are engaged in is an extremely important part of improving the material conditions of the working class in this country. And despite the struggles, despite the major hurdles and the flaming hoops that everyone has to jump through in order to reach that sort of stability, even in the last 10 years, the work you've done is amazing, right? And no contribution is too small in furthering this project and moving towards much more equitable and stable and beautiful living conditions for everyone in this country.
It can happen.
So
It can happen.
it can happen. And I really want to thank you for taking the time to come and talk about this. Please come back on the show anytime to talk about the work that your tenants union is doing, or work that the ATUN is doing. I will be signing up for that conference. I'm really excited to see the kind of work that you're doing.
Yeah, there's some great, there'll be some Spanish language stuff that Latu will be doing. Latu, the largest, the one they're doing it the biggest right now. And yeah, lots of admiration for what they're doing. So definitely Folks should check that out. There's some really great workshops that are happening, and that are really practical. Like it's basic stuff. It's not even like the Socialism conference where you're talking about like these big ideas. Like this is like
Overbroad,
how do
yeah.
you knock on a door? Like how do you like just a very basic stuff. And I think everyone needs it. I think a great thing is like to think about Teddy, who wrote this article that I didn't even realize that he was in the union at this point, like as he was doing this research. And I had met him before, and I had seen him at an action before. um Everybody's in this, like we're all in this situation. Like we've got to start realizing that there's not these like sort of clean defined lines. Like the working class is broad, it's diverse, and we are eventually gonna win. There's just too many of us not to.
That's true. That's a great yes. Great way to end this. Is there before we go, are where can we find updates with your union, or where can we find the sign up for the
So the
conference?
conference again, that's ATUN dash RSIA.org, and that's the Autonomous Tenant Union Network. You can click on the navigation bar there, says 2024 virtual convention. It's just a Zoom link that you register with. For us, like we have a fair, I think probably our strongest presence is on Instagram. You can just type in Crown Heights Tenant Union, but also crownheightstenantunion.org, or info at crownheightstenantunion.org. Anybody can reach out. Like we are very local, and but you know, again, like if you're having issues and you want like maybe a referral to a group that's working in your area, or just want some advice on something, like definitely reach out to us. Like we're here to use whatever we've learned in the last 10 years to support everybody in this fight. Like it only helps us to have people in Wisconsin that are doing this, and so it gets us a little bit closer to where we want to be. So yeah, crownheightstenantunion.org. Please check it out.
Great. Thanks so much for coming on, Esteban,
Absolutely.
and come back anytime.
Thank you.
That's it for us here at the Real News Network podcast. Once again, I am your host, Mel Buer. If you loved today's episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get notified when the next one drops. We usually try to put these out every Thursday, so keep an eye out. You can find us on most platforms, including Spotify and YouTube. And if you follow us on YouTube, please be sure to like this video and subscribe. Share with your friends. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, you can find me on most social media, most notably Twitter or X, if that's your flavor. My DMs are always open, and I check them regularly. Send me a message via email if you'd like at mel@therealnews.com. You can send your tips, comments, questions, episode ideas, gripes, complaints, whatever you'd like. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I will see you next time.
Thank you so much for watching the Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work, so please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to the Real News Network. Solidarity forever.